Beta-lactam antibiotics, like penicillins and cephalosporins, have a beta-lactam ring in their structure, which gives them their name. These medications inhibit cell wall synthesis in bacteria. Unfortunately for us, bacteria are becoming increasingly resilient to beta-lactams, so we've come up with non-beta-lactam medications to inhibit cell wall synthesis. Now, to overcome these resistances, we've found ways to inhibit cell wall synthesis at multiple stages. So, our body consists of multiple eukaryotic cells, while bacteria are prokaryotic, meaning they're primitive, single-cellular organisms. Most have a slimy capsule made out of polysaccharides and a cell wall which encapsulates and protects the bacteria like a suit of armor, and offers structural support. Bacterial cell walls are made of a substance called peptidoglycan, or murein. Peptidoglycan is a molecule composed of long strands of amino polysaccharides running in parallel. These are made of segments of N-acetylglucosamine, or NAG, and N-acetylmuramic acid, or NAM, in an alternating pattern, so NAG, NAM, NAG, NAM, and so on, like a pearl necklace. At the tips of and protruding from the NAM subunits are tetrapeptide and pentapeptide chains. These peptide chains can link to other peptide chains from the neighboring strands through a process known as transpeptidation. This is carried out by an enzyme called DD transpeptidase, or penicillin binding proteins, or PBPs. Now, these enzymes are like locks, and there are specific binding areas for the pentapeptide keys to fit into. Once the key goes in the lock, the PBP enzymes fuse them together, creating a stable link between the two amino polysaccharide strands, and strengthening the cell wall. In essence, all beta-lactam antibiotics, like the penicillins, somewhat resemble the tetrapeptide chains. Inside the bacteria, PBP enzymes will mistakenly bind to the beta-lactam antibiotic molecule instead of a tetrapeptide, and stick inside the PBP forever, like putting chewing gum in a keyhole, permanently disabling it. As more and more PBPs get disabled, the cross-linking fails to happen, and the wall becomes weak and unstable. If the affected bacteria attempts to divide, their cell wall will collapse, killing them in the process. Now, some bacteria have developed resistance to beta-lactam antibiotics. The most notable is the notorious Staphylococcus aureus, which evolved to have enzymes called beta-lactamases or penicillinases that break down the beta-lactam ring within the antibiotic, rendering it ineffective. In response, though, we started adding beta-lactamase inhibitors, like clavulanic acid, that would bind to beta-lactamases and inactivate them, again like the gum into a keyhole. Another approach was to create new kinds of beta-lactam antibiotics, like methicillin, which has a large side chain that wouldn't fit into the keyhole of the beta-lactamase. These did work pretty well, until some Staphylococcus aureus developed PBP site mutations that changed the shape of the keyhole. So even if beta-lactamase enzymes can't break down these antibiotics, they won't fit into the PBP enzyme and thus won't work. We call these bacteria methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus, or MRSA. This poses a huge problem, because it makes MRSA virtually untreatable by beta-lactam antibiotics. To treat MRSA, we resort to so-called reserve antibiotics belonging to the glycopeptide antibiotics, like vancomycin and teicoplanin. But even that might come to an end, as MRSA is also developing vancomycin resistance, becoming VRSA. We want to make a simple and fun mnemonic that'll help you efficiently memorize the medications that work on each of these stages. So first we can use bacteria carrying wheelbarrows for the transport proteins that move NAM and NAG across the cell membrane. Next are the bacterial security guards, which represent the beta-lactamase enzymes. They're protecting the bacterial masons, which are the PBPs that build the cell wall. Finally, we have the wall itself, which is under construction. Our first class of medication is the bactoperenol inhibitors, like bacitracin. It works by blocking bactoperenol phosphate, which is the transmembrane transporter embedded within the bacterial cell membrane. It lets NAM and NAG molecules cross from inside the cell membrane to the outside, where they're needed for the synthesis of peptidoglycan. Once the transport protein is inhibited, new peptidoglycan can no longer be made. Bacitracin has a very narrow spectrum and only works against a few gram-positive bacteria like Staphylococcus aureus, Staphylococcus epidermidis, and Streptococcus pyogenes. And even then, it only works topically, meaning it's used to treat skin and eye infections by rubbing it onto the affected area. They're never to be applied intravenously or intramuscularly, as they're highly nephrotoxic and can lead to renal failure if used for systemic infections. Alright, so back to the mnemonic. For this class of medication, we're attacking bacterial cell membrane transport proteins represented by the wheelbarrows. Let's have a basilisk, representing bacitracin, attack them. These bacteria are purple, since bacitracin works on common gram-positive bacteria that stains purple. Let's have it shed its skin, because this medication is for topical use only, for treating certain skin infections. Next, let's look at how we can overcome the beta-lactamase problem. One way is to shut them down with beta-lactamase inhibitors. Members of this group include clavulanic acid, tazobactam, and sulbactam. These medications play a supportive role and are given with beta-lactams like penicillin. Once inside the bacteria, they bind permanently to the beta-lactamase enzymes and disable them, which allows the penicillins to do their work. However, they're more effective against gram-negative bacteria since gram-positive bacteria like Staph aureus often have PBP mutations that render the penicillins ineffective. These combo medications often have their own names, like Augmentin, which is a combination of amoxicillin and clavulanic acid. Again, back to the mnemonic. Let's look at the bacterial security guards representing the beta-lactamases. We have an erupting volcano to represent clavulanic acid, and a police officer with a baton to represent tazobactam and sulbactam. Together, they're enough to scare away the security guards. Notice some are pink, since gram-negative bacteria stain pink, and the rest are purple for the gram-positive bacteria. This clears the way for the penda with a pen, our symbol for penicillin. Next are two groups of beta-lactam antibiotics that have a slight twist. First are carbapenems, which include imipenem, meropenem, ertapenem, and doropenem. They bind to PBPs and inhibit cell wall synthesis, just like penicillin. However, the twist is that they possess a modified ring structure. So instead of a sulfur atom at position 1, they have a carbon atom. This tiny change makes the beta-lactamases unable to bind to the medication. Carbapenems are considered to be more potent than the beta-lactams. Their spectrum is wider and they cover most of the gram-positive and gram-negative bacteria as well as anaerobic species. With the exception of ertapenem, carbapenems are notably useful against Acinetobacter species, which cause nosocomial infections like ventilator-associated pneumonia, and Pseudomonas aeruginosa, a bacteria so hardcore and resilient, it swims laps in hand disinfectant just to wake up in the morning. These medications are only used when other antibiotics fail, since they have severe central nervous system toxicity and could cause seizures. Imipenem is rapidly broken down in the kidneys by tubular dehydropeptidase. To make things worse, the metabolites are also nephrotoxic, and that's why it's used with cilastatin, which inhibits the tubular dehydropeptidase. The other beta-lactam medication we'll talk about are the monobactams. The only member of the family that's currently used is aztreonam. Unlike the other beta-lactams, their beta-lactam ring is not fused to any other ring, and it's sticking out on its own. This makes them resistant to beta-lactamases, as they can't fit properly inside them. They're very effective against gram-negative bacteria, like Escherichia coli and Proteus species, as well as the dreaded Pseudomonas aeruginosa, but they're completely ineffective against gram-positive ones. Aztreonam is well tolerated and has few side effects. Once again, back to the mnemonic. For this scene, we have the two groups of beta-lactams that are directly assaulting the bacteria masons representing the PBPs. First, coming in from the bottom, is a lone Amazon warrior for aztreonam. She's only attacking pink-colored masons because it's effective against gram-negative bacteria only. She's also throwing a spear at a Mona Lisa look-alike representing Pseudomonas. Next, flanking from the top, are the carbapenems. which are represented by a squad of carb-rich penne pasta soldiers. We have them attack second because they're used after other antibiotics have proven ineffective. Leading them is their emperor, representing imipenem. He's carrying a celery scepter because we need cilastatin to prevent breakdown of the medication in the kidneys. The army is attacking both purple and pink masons since they're effective against both gram-positive and gram-negative bacteria. One of their main targets is the other Mona Lisa lookalike, and she's holding a fishbowl to represent anaerobic bacteria, and a large cinema ticket for Acinetobacter. But it's highly unlikely that she'll make it to the movies this day. Now, one of the pasta soldiers is shamefully tap dancing away from the Mona Lisa. He represents ertapenem, the only carbapenem with no effect against Pseudomonas. War can be grim, and some of the pasta soldiers are lying on their side, with their head chopped off and twitching. This will help you remember the severe cerebral nervous system toxicities that could lead to seizures. The final family of medications is the glycopeptide antibiotics, like vancomycin, telavancin, and teicoplanin. They inhibit cell wall synthesis by latching onto the tetrapeptide chains, preventing them from being linked by the PBP enzyme. Glycopeptides do not act on the PBP, which allow them to bypass the PBP mutations that make MRSA so resistant to beta-lactams. However, some Staphylococcus aureus have evolved to have a D-lactate at the tip of the tetrapeptides, so glycopeptides cannot bind to them. Some of these strains have partial resistance and are called vancomycin intermediate Staphylococcus aureus, or VISA for short. Strains with complete resistance are called vancomycin-resistant Staph aureus, or VRSA. Glycopeptides are most often used to treat gram-positive bacteria that are resistant to other medications. They can't be absorbed in the GI tract, so they're typically given intravenously when treating systemic infections. Per oral vancomycin can be given to treat GI infections like Clostridium difficile. Adverse drug reactions include thrombophlebitis, ototoxicity, nephrotoxicity, and so-called red man syndrome, which is caused by diffuse flushing. Back again to the mnemonic. We're now looking at the wall and we have 3 vehicles representing these medications. There's a van with a mouse logo for vancomycin, a van with a TV logo for telavancin, and a police or cop plane for teicoplanin. Now, these medications act directly on the molecules that make up the cell wall, so let's have them crash into it. The wall itself is purple to represent gram-positive bacteria. And let's put some barbed wire on it because glycopeptides are used to treat infections that are resistant to other medications. Toppling off the wall, there's a closet for Clostridium. And on top of that is a Mars rover for MRSA. For side effects, let's use the driver of the van who's running away from the vehicle. He's dressed in a red ninja outfit to represent red man syndrome. He's wearing headphones that are blasting loud music for ototoxicity. And one of his legs is covered in bulging blue veins for thrombophlebitis. He's also holding his injured flank as he hobbles away to help you remember nephrotoxicity. Alright, as a quick recap, let's look at a mind map that'll help organize the information we covered. Multiple families of cell wall synthesis inhibitors are created to combat the ever-increasing resistance in bacteria. Bactoprenol inhibitors like bacitracin inhibit the transport proteins that move NAG and NAM units across the cell membrane. Beta-lactamase inhibitors like clavulanic acid are used to disable beta-lactamases, and they need to be used in combination with other beta-lactams like penicillin. Carbapenems like imipenem and monobactams like aztreonam are beta-lactam antibiotics with slightly modified structures. This makes them impervious to beta-lactamase degradation, so they can inhibit PBPs. Glycopeptides like vancomycin bind to tetrapeptides that make up the cell wall. This allows them to bypass bacterial resistance based on PBP mutations. They're mostly used for dealing with highly resistant bacteria like MRSA. But wait, there's more. Here's a mind map with all of the mnemonics from the video. Go ahead and pause the video so you can test yourself to see what you remember. And stay tuned for the answers at the end. Cephalosporins are antibiotics which got their name from a mold known as Cephalosporium, from which they were originally extracted. They belong to the pharmacological group of beta-lactam antibiotics. What all beta-lactams have in common is a beta-lactam ring in their structure, which gives them their name, and also the mechanism of action, which is the inhibition of cell wall synthesis in bacteria. So our body consists of multiple eukaryotic cells, while bacteria are prokaryotic, meaning they're primitive, single-cellular organisms. Most have a slimy capsule made out of polysaccharides and a cell wall which encapsulates and protects the bacteria like a suit of armor, and offers structural support. Bacterial cell walls are made of a substance called peptidoglycan, or murine. Peptidoglycan is a molecule composed of long strands of amino polysaccharides running in parallel. These are made of segments of N-acetylglucosamine, or NAG, and N-acetylmuramic acid, or NAM, in an alternating pattern, so NAG, NAM, NAG, NAM, and so on, like a pearl necklace. At the tips of and protruding from the NAM subunits are tetrapeptide and pentapeptide chains. These peptide chains can link to other peptide chains from the neighboring strands through a process known as transpeptidation. This is carried out by an enzyme called DD transpeptidase, or penicillin binding proteins, or PBPs. Now, these enzymes are like locks, and there are specific binding areas for the pentapeptide keys to fit into. Once the key goes in the lock, the PBP enzymes fuse them together, creating a stable link between the two amino polysaccharide strands, and strengthening the cell wall. In essence, all beta-lactam antibiotics, like the penicillins, somewhat resemble the tetrapeptide chains. Inside the bacteria, PBP enzymes will mistakenly bind to the beta-lactam antibiotic molecule instead of a tetrapeptide, and stick inside the PBP forever, like putting chewing gum in a keyhole, permanently disabling it. As more and more PBPs get disabled, the cross-linking fails to happen, and the wall becomes weak and unstable. If the affected bacteria attempts to divide, their cell wall will collapse, killing them in the process. Now, some bacteria have developed resistance to beta-lactam antibiotics. The most notable is the notorious Staphylococcus aureus, which evolved to have enzymes called beta-lactamases or penicillinases that break down the beta-lactam ring within the antibiotic, rendering it ineffective. In response, though, we started adding beta-lactamase inhibitors, like clavulanic acid, that would bind to beta-lactamases and inactivate them, again like the gum into a keyhole. Another approach was to create new kinds of beta-lactam antibiotics, like methicillin, which has a large side chain that wouldn't fit into the keyhole of the beta-lactamase. These did work pretty well, until some Staphylococcus aureus developed PBP site mutations that changed the shape of the keyhole. So even if beta-lactamase enzymes can't break down these antibiotics, they won't fit into the PBP enzyme and thus won't work. We call these bacteria methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus, or MRSA. This poses a huge problem, because it makes MRSA virtually untreatable by beta-lactam antibiotics. To treat MRSA, we resort to so-called reserve antibiotics belonging to the glycopeptide antibiotics, like vancomycin and teicoplanin. But even that might come to an end, as MRSA is also developing vancomycin resistance, becoming VRSA. Cephalosporins are a very versatile group of antibiotics, and new members of the family get discovered all the time. Cephalosporins are usually classified into loose generations, depending on their usage profile, or simply put, what they're effective against. It's important to know that generations are not age-related. There are currently 5 generations of cephalosporins. The first generation has the narrowest spectrum, and is mainly used to treat gram-positive bacteria. And generally, each successive generation expands the spectrum to treat a wider variety of bacteria. Alright, so let's make a simple and fun mnemonic that'll help you efficiently memorize and retain all these crazy farm facts. So let's imagine an apartment complex with 3 rooms in a row. The first room is pretty dilapidated, and the tenants represent the first and second gen. The second room is just average, and the tenants represent third and fourth gen, which are broad spectrum. The 5th gen gets the fanciest room, since it's the broad spectrum and it could even treat MRSA. So the 1st gen cephalosporins, like cephalexin and cefazolin, are useful against gram-positive bacteria. They're effective against streptococci and staphylococci that cause skin infections, and they're also taken prophylactically to prevent infections from surgical procedures. However, they're only effective against staphylococci that have not yet evolved beta-lactamases. They're also effective against a few gram-negative bacteria that cause urinary tract infections, like Proteus mirabilis, Escherichia coli, and Klebsiella pneumoniae. Now let's go back to our apartment complex mnemonic. On one side of the dilapidated room, we have the 1st gen cephalosporins, represented by Alexander the Great, Alexin, playing the violin, cefazolin. Since he's horrible at it, there's a lot of people in here complaining, which represent the bacteria. First, we have a protester holding up a protest sign for Proteus. Next is an annoyed border collie for E. coli. Then there's a very angry person carrying a large club, Klebsiella. All 3 of them are waiting by the bathroom because they cause urinary tract infections. The final person is a surgeon, representing surgical prophylaxis, and he's scratching himself all over because he has skin infections. Next are the 2nd generation cephalosporins, which include cefaclor, cefprozil, cefuroxime, cefodotan, and cefoxidin. These medications are like an upgrade over 1st generation cephalosporins. First, they're more resistant to beta-lactamase. Second, they have comparable effectiveness for treating gram-positive bugs, and they cover more gram-negative bugs. These include Haemophilus influenzae, Serratia marcescens, Enterobacter aerogenes, and some Neisseria species. In addition, cefotetin and cefoxidin are the only cephalosporins that can treat anaerobic bacteria like Bacteroides fragilis, which causes peritonitis. Going back to the mnemonic, we'll put the 2nd gen cephalosporins on the other side of the dilapidated room. These medications will be represented by a falcon, for cefaclor, wearing a furry coat, for ceffuroxime, eating a giant pretzel, or cefprozil. He's got a pet fox, cefoxidin, which is peeking out from a giant teacup, cefotetin. For the bugs, remember 2nd gen can treat all the bacteria covered by the 1st gen, plus a few more. So on the floor, there's a tiny vampire bat for Haemophilus, since hemo means blood and philus means like. Let's also add in a tiny Loch Ness monster for Neisseria. The 2 of them are fighting over a sausage which represents Enterobacter, since entero means intestine, which is what sausages are made of. To divide it up, they're using a saw for Serratia, since serrated means saw-like. Finally, cefoxidin and cefotetin are the only cephalosporins used against anaerobic bacteria. So let's use a fishbowl full of water to represent a low oxygen environment. We can put an angry bacteria on steroids in there for Bacteroides. This is what's scaring the fox and causing him to hide in the teacup. Moving on to the 3rd generation cephalosporins, which include cefixime, ceftriaxone, cefotaxime, and ceftazidime. These are broad-spectrum antibiotics which improves anti-gram-negative activity at the cost of decreased efficiency against gram-positive bacteria. These cephalosporins can cross the blood-brain barrier, making them first-line treatment for bacterial meningitis, which can be caused by Haemophilus influenzae, pneumococci, meningococci, and Neisseria species. Nowadays, 3rd gen cephalosporins are also the antibiotic of choice against penicillin-resistant Neisseria gonorrhoeae. In addition, ceftazidime is effective in treating Pseudomonas aeruginosa, a bacteria so hardcore and resilient, it swims laps in hand disinfectant just to wake up in the morning. Ceftriaxone is effective in treating Borrelia burgdorferi, which causes Lyme disease. Again, back to the mnemonic. We're in the 2nd room now, and the medications in here are broad spectrum. Let's put a lot of books in here because the medications in this room can get to the brain, kind of like knowledge. For the 3rd gen medications, we have a mechanic living here to represent cefixime. He's working on fixing a taxi representing cefotaxime. The taxi's in for repair because there's an axe with 3 heads stuck in the windshield for ceftriaxone. The mechanic was paid with a giant dime for ceftazidime. To help you remember what this class of medication treats, we can use the mechanic's old memorabilia from high school. On a shelf, there's his high school football helmet, with a flame logo on it to represent meningitis. And below it is the gong he played in band, representing gonorrhea. Now, ceftazidime is special, since it's the only 3rd-gen cephalosporin that could treat Pseudomonas aeruginosa. So if you flip the dime over, it has the face of the Mona Lisa. Ceftriaxone can be used to treat Lyme disease, which is spread by ticks. So let's have the triangular axe smash a giant tick against the windshield. Next are the 4th-generation cephalosporins, which are an upgrade over the 3rd-gen, and have an even wider spectrum of activity. The main medication in this class is cefepime, which is just as effective against gram-negative bacteria as the 3rd-gen cephalosporins. Plus, it's also comparable to 1st-gen when it comes to gram-positive infections. It's also effective against Pseudomonas, and it also crosses the blood-brain barrier. Cefepime is often used to treat the same infections as the 3rd-gen, like meningitis. It's also more resistant to beta-lactamases than any other cephalosporin, so they're often used to treat nosocomial bacterial infections, or infections originating from the hospital. However, cefepime is still ineffective against MRSA, just like the other cephalosporins. Back to the mnemonic. The main 4th-gen cephalosporin in the US is cefepime, which will be represented by a primate, so we'll use a gorilla. It shares the room with the mechanic, so it can be used to treat many of the same infections as the 3rd-gen. It's also effective against Pseudomonas, so let's have him paint a picture of the Mona Lisa, except she's in a hospital bed to represent nosocomial infections. Finally, we get to the 5th generation of cephalosporins, and the main medication in this class is ceftaroline. This is also a broad-spectrum antibiotic, but it does not cross the blood-brain barrier. This medication is very important, since it's the only cephalosporin that can treat MRSA. For the mnemonic, let's move to the last and nicest room. 5th gen is so amazing. It gets the room all for itself. Let's have a kid jumping on a trampoline to represent ceftaroline. He's super rich, so he's bought the Mars rover, representing MRSA. Adverse drug reactions related to cephalosporins are usually mild and unspecific, including diarrhea, nausea, rash, and tenderness at the injection site. These medications can cause disulfiram-like reaction. If alcohol is consumed while taking cephalosporin, the person might experience nausea, flushing, and rapid heartbeat. There's also cross-reactivity between penicillin and cephalosporin. So if someone took penicillin, they can develop an allergy to both penicillin and cephalosporin. As the last part of the mnemonic, let's put an emergency exit at the back of the apartment complex. Blocking the door are 2 pens forming a cross to represent cross-reactivity with penicillin. In front of the door are a few empty beer bottles to represent disulfiram reaction. Alright, as a quick recap, cephalosporins are bactericidal antibiotics and members of the beta-lactam antibiotic family which inhibit cell wall synthesis. There are 5 generations of cephalosporins. 1st-gen medications are usually used to treat gram-positive infections, UTIs caused by a few gram-negative bacteria, and as prophylaxis before surgery. 2nd-gen can treat a wider variety of gram-negative bacteria, and some are effective against anaerobes. Generation 3 and 4 are wide-spectrum and cross the blood-brain barrier, making them the first-line treatment for bacterial meningitis. Ceftazidime from the 3rd gen and cefepime from the 4th gen are also effective against Pseudomonas. Gen 5 is also wide-spectrum but does not cross the blood-brain barrier. It's the only class of cephalosporins effective against MRSA. But wait, there's more. Here's a mind map with all of the mnemonics from the video. Go ahead and pause the video so you can test yourself to see what you remember. Stay tuned for the answers at the end.